peculiar space can become a means of grace.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and of course that goes back to what you were talking about yesterday, or what we were talking about yesterday, pilgrimage. Yeah. Because why go someplace? And yet if you do go someplace, it does, quote, feel different. Well, is that spiritual feeling, or is that just emotion that, you know, I'm dredging up from some past experience?
And without if you just turn to nature to, you know, to apprehend and experience God, apart from the sacramental life of the church, apart from the scriptures, apart from Eucharist, apart from all of that, right? Shaping your understanding, your apprehension of God and God's presence. Well, then you end up with something like what Annie Dillard ends up with in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. God is a horrendous monster, you know, right? Because she observes nature, you know, observes the water bug, you know, draining the frog of its, you know, of its insides, right? And she observes the praying mantis eating its lover and all the rest, and says, you know, what kind of God is this, right? So you don't end up with a God whose nature is love, you know, you end up with, so you have to have, you know, right?
Well, I mean, just to follow up on that idea then, I agree that, and I think that this speaks partially to what's occurring. Somebody else, I mean, you've been asked questions by outsiders, I've been asked questions by outsiders, and we're insiders almost, because it is based at the university, and while the seminary is assisting, I think, very well, doing a lot of wonderful things, it's really more their event.
That's right.
As far as that sacred space goes, at least. In fact, my wife said somebody expressed significant anger to her. The only person she's seen be angry the entire past week. She said, because she said, there's no more space inside. She was helping, they'd asked her to help her monitor the doors, and so there's no more space inside, but you can go across the road to the seminary. The person said, that's not the same, I can't be there, so. You know, it's an interesting argument about sacred space, but let me just add one other thing though, based on what you were saying, and also Dillard for that matter too. When one walks a pilgrimage, there are two things about pilgrimages that I've noticed people who have not been pilgrims will say, and they're just wrong. Somebody will say, well, it's not getting there, it's the walking. No, it isn't. It's getting there. And the walking obviously is fundamental to the experience of arriving. It's part of the process of arriving is to walk the journey, but you've got to get to the place, to the sacred space. And in that sacred space, the other characteristic that I think late modern, I guess we can call them postmodern, but certainly late modern notions of pilgrim lack, is they think it's an individual activity. It's not. Even when you're walking by yourself, you're walking on a path towards something that's going to be communal. And one thing that I have noticed about what's across the street is at first I called it calm, but that's not right because the Christian word's better. It's gentle and it's highly communitarian. And I think late modern notions of pilgrimage, of sacred journey, of like you were talking about worshiping out with the trees, okay, fine, but if you're not in community, how is that the same thing? God does seem to want to use community as a place where he expresses himself, sacramentally or in near sacraments.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, the holy has a drawing power. And so it doesn't just draw me, it draws all kinds of people, all people to itself, right? And so, you know, I was driving in this morning and in the rain, and, you know.
I bet you wondered whether people would be there.
I did.
And they are.
And they are. There's this line, people standing in the rain, you know. Hopefully they all have umbrellas, right?
I know.
But it reminded me of the story I shared with you before about going to see, you know, some relics at a Catholic church, you know, in Arlington, Texas, and getting there in the evening, in the dark, and it was raining. And it was extraordinary. I'll never forget it. This was, you know, 25 years ago. And the line of people standing, waiting to get in the church in the rain. And when I saw that this morning, it was the same scene. And it just speaks to, you know, whatever you make of relics or other holy objects. You know, we're not Catholic here at Asbury, but there's something similar about what's happening across the street, and when you see something like that.
Well, I told you yesterday, I showed you that early modern print of Santiago de Compostela, and it looks like this. It's just this long line of pilgrims wanting to get in. Well, I did want to push a little bit on the way you framed it in one of your blogs. This notion of pilgrimage, do you think it's one that a lot of folks would accept across the street, especially because for the students, it isn't a pilgrimage, it's their community. And there's almost been, with a couple, not mean-spirited, but a concern that they're being usurped by pilgrims.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. You know, I watched the video of the student body president on TV last night.
Saw it. Yeah.
You know, and she, I think that came up a little bit about just the fact that people are coming here from all around the world. And, you know, my sense is that at least speaking for the student body, you know, she was suggesting that they saw this as a matter of extending the grace that they've experienced in this revival to the world.
Right.
Now, I could see why, you know, it has been. Let's be honest. It's been unsettling for all of us, even on the seminary side of the street.
Yep.
You know, we come to campus, and you know our usual parking spots aren't available.
I got wet walking in today. Yeah.
So you know, it's where are all these people coming from?
Right.
And I think if, you know, there is that tendency to want to say, hey, wait a minute, that's my parking space. But on the other hand, you look around and then another question emerges, which is, why are they here? And then I think when we contemplate that question, I think the student body president has been thinking about that.
Right.
You know, why are all these people here? And the more you think about that, you know, you sort of you forget about your parking space, right? You know, and the way this is interrupting our lives.
Yeah, I doubt that she has read our former colleague's work, but I'll bring it up. You know, Christine Pohl's argument, hospitality is almost inevitably inconvenient, but that's not intrinsically bad. It may be that the convenience of your life was actually impeding your own next step in spiritual maturity. Maybe that's what's happening too. I do think it's important for us to not be irritated with people when we get wet walking in, or when people park all over the place. I did get a little miffed when somebody parked and blocked in a disabled parking spot. I don't think they did it intentionally, but they made it so that it was hard to get in and out of that particular parking place. Other than that, though, people have been outsiders, and folks who live in the community have been really pretty gracious to each other.
Yeah. You know, I think when this thing first started, and really even before people started coming, the first 2 or 3 days of this revival, that was...
can you use that word?
Right, exactly.
We'll have to talk about that.
Exactly.
I mean, that's
right.
Yeah. By the way, I would. I don't see what the problem is.
When it first started, you know, and there weren't that many people here from the outside. You know, it was, you know, there was so much debate that happened about, you know, whether it was a revival. Was it an authentic revival? Is that even the right word to use? If I'm being honest, I was a little bit disheartened by the number of my own, you know, Christian friends, fellow ministers, who, you know, that was really their take. It was a kind of critical, you know, well, you know, this can only be a revival if this or that, wanting to debate, you know, what was actually happening. People worried about, you know, their kind of preconceived notions of what happens at a revival, which turned out, in fact, as you and I have talked about, just not to be true at all. One of the characteristic, especially in those early days, one of the characteristic features of this revival was the lack of any kind of you know, emotional outburst,
not
or
highly
anything
demonstrative.
Like that. No, it wasn't.
Very quiet.
Very quiet, and in a very beautiful way. When I first went, as you know, I mean, it was, what struck me was this almost palpable sense of peace and peacefulness.
I agree.
That's really what hit me in a way that's never happened before. And I've been in a lot of different revival settings, as have you. And you know, but I think what has happened since then is more and more people have come. I've noticed that some of the criticism and cautionary kind of angles have really receded in terms of social media. And now this other question has been emerging. Why is there so much interest in this? Why are so many people coming here? To the point that it's now showing up on the evening news, mainstream evening news. What is this that it, you know, what's going on here? And that's where you and I keep coming back to this topic of holiness and the holy and people's hunger and thirst for God.
Can I try to answer this and then you can fill it in more positively? Because sociologically, conversion tends to arise because of cognitive dissonance, because something isn't working somehow. Maybe a family crisis. For me, I became a Christian ultimately, if I look back upon it, because I had an intellectual crisis. I decided life was absurd, or there had to be a God who cared about me. It wasn't enough there was a God. It had to be a God who cared about me and could do something about it. Well, I had somebody ask me from a media source, is this associated with the decline of United Methodism? And the person said, I know you're not a United Methodist Seminary, but you are in the Methodist movement. Is this correlated, was the word that the person used. And I said, exactly. It's correlated, but it's not causally related. They're both arising out of the same thing. I think, sociologically speaking, the decline in Christendom and the rise of, for lack of a better way to put it, incoherence, the disassembly of the self into near nothingness, the turning of the body into mere instrument instead of part of who we essentially are. Those things did lead to the failures in old line Protestantism. They're also leading to revivals, I think, for people under 25, under 30, because those people are growing up not alienated, they're growing up anomic. There is no sense of meaning, of coherence. A revival like this, if nothing else, provides coherence. Now, an outsider might say, well, that's just, you know, lots of evil things can, or bad things can provide coherence, to which I'd respond, really, how are you defining evil? I mean, what is the source that gives any character to anything? And that's what these people are saying. There is a source. There is a character to our existence that matters. To use a technical term, a telos to our lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and you know, theologically, I mean, we could draw here on someone like Augustine, you know, that God has made us to desire God, to long for God. I think there's an even bigger map in some ways that the situation in Methodism is itself a kind of, it exemplifies it, but this bigger map is really the whole modern story. I mean, I was teaching contemporary theology yesterday, and we were talking about kind of the loss of, if you will, a sacramental orientation to creation, to the cosmos. That in some sense, you know, maybe was the result of what we sometimes think of as modernity, you know, an emerging kind of unimaginative materialism, right? But in another sense, it happens because the church, we gave away the store. We gave up on a kind of sacramental vision. And part of what I suggested to the students is, you know, really what we're talking about again is holiness. And when we don't identify and describe and name the holy in the world, people will go looking for it elsewhere. And it will show up elsewhere. And I think that's partly what you see happening in an event like this.
I agree. So I'd put it this way, coming from the perspective of ethical analysis. descriptively, what's going on purely descriptively, if there is such a thing at the end of modernity, what's going on across the street is, in a social sense, very similar to the repaganizing of nature, of the world. But I'd say normatively, there's a vast difference. Then that what's going on across the street is correct. It's right, it's good, it's beautiful, use the transcendentals. It actually is the thing that ought to be, where repaganizing is a mere substitute for an absence that's been created by the destruction of the mediating institutions of the church and the maybe appropriate end of Christendom. Let me ask one follow-up too on the theological point. When you were talking about that process, Kierkegaard came to mind, and if there's that sort of shallow aesthete life, it doesn't matter whether it's sipping champagne and nibbling on baked brie or knocking down a POC and watching World Wrestling, it's all the same. You're trying not to think about your existence. And then these folks shift into the ethical, like the atheistic existentialists. But Kierkegaard said that it won't work.
That's right.
So you either go back to the aesthete life, or you commit ethical suicide, or you take the leap of faith. And the thing that is occurring over there, and I think Kierkegaard was anticipating the discourse about anomie, about meaninglessness, not mere alienation. The difference here is, once you take that leap of faith, you're leaping as an individual, but you're leaping into community.
Yes.
And maybe if Kierkegaard had lived long enough, he would have talked about this, but I do see community over here as pretty strong characteristic. I mean, people are praying with each other, albeit very gently, and only if requested to do so.
Yes.
Do you think, what's the role of community? Because when you're talking about holiness in the Methodist tradition, I think that's another thing that led to the decline of the old line Protestant Methodist branch, at least, is they lost accountability.
Yeah, it's so funny because in my mind, as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, the alternative, the aesthete, the ethical, the alternative just is the sacramental life of the church, which is communal. It's what the Spirit draws us into, ultimately through baptism, into communion with each other, with the Lord, the fellowship of believers. We become incorporated into Christ's body. And so, in a sense, one of the things I've been working to say in various ways is that we need to be careful about, setting what's happening here at odds with what takes place in the regular sacramental life of the church. That, in a sense, what this will need eventually is Christological focus. It's got to be, or it doesn't end up becoming.
Right.
You were talking about how it just becomes pagan, right? It has to be brought to Christological focus. And I think the way we do that is ultimately through word and sacrament. So these things have to work together. Now, for a lot of the students, they came to this already as baptized believers, as Christians. But for someone that might be coming here from the outside, who isn't formed in the faith, right? I think you do have a danger that this just becomes a kind of pagan. They could walk away worshiping what amounts to a pagan deity.
Right. Well, wasn't that the issue that Whitefield brought up at the end of his ministry, as he deviated further and further from the good things that he had been part of in the early Methodist movement? But aside from some social ethical things he failed at, he also didn't keep people accountable. They'd convert and they wouldn't be accountable. I don't think that's what's happening across the street.
I don't either.
I think that notion of accountability as both mutual care and mutual responsibility, I think, is what we're going to see. I don't know. We have to guess at that. We can only go with probabilities at this point. We're not 20 years out. I don't know what'll happen, but it looks like it's going a good way.
I think so. The coming together, though, the communal aspect, I do think that's just in keeping with the work of the Spirit. I mean, you certainly see it at Pentecost. I mean, the Spirit draws people together, ultimately draws people to Christ. Now, exactly how that works in, let's call it a kind of irregular event like this, that's something that we're working as hard as we can to shape, to give it that that focus on Christ. But at the same time, this is the kind of thing that I trust the Spirit to do this work in ways that we can't apprehend yet.
Right. I'm perfectly comfortable calling this revival. I
Absolutely.
will say I would be more cautious using the language of awakening. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The Great Awakening, the Trans-Appalachian Awakening, right, yes, maybe the urban awakening of the burned over district in New York. Certainly I'd call the 1970s Jesus People period an awakening. Somebody asked me in an interview that, is this going to become something more? Well, I don't know. So I can value it as good as a revival for the students in the media community. And interestingly, I'll mention this as an aside, but you can pick up on it, strongly affirmed by our very large international student body. On this side of the street, there are a lot of internationals, and they appreciate what they're seeing. But as to whether or not that'll become an awakening, I don't have any idea. I mean, is it spreading to a couple other campuses? Yeah. Will it probably die out? Yeah. That doesn't make it bad. It makes it a good thing that maybe something else will come along. Do you think it can become an awakening? Do you think those things occur every 30, 40, 50 years because the old saying, God doesn't have grandchildren, you know? I mean, what's going to happen?
There's that one thesis out there, every 500 years there's this huge, whatever that was, right? So I think, first of all, like you, I don't have a problem referring to it as a revival. I think that I also don't have a lot invested in that word per se.
Right.
I've been speaking of it more as a kind of manifestation of God's presence and power in an unusual and perhaps a unique, somewhat unique kind of way in a very particular place. So I'm more comfortable speaking of it that way, and maybe the thing I want to emphasize here is when we think of what's happening here as a manifestation of God's presence and power in our midst, that, and first of all, to say, we have to set aside preconceived notions of what that looks like. Right? It may not be, as I said in a blog post, right, of swinging from the chandeliers. As it turns out,
Clearly
in this case, it's not.
Right.
But the other thing is that when you deal with a genuine kind of manifestation of God's presence and power, I think it tends to resist easy kind of definition. It's going to resist our categories. So one of the things I've noticed is various people are wanting to read it through the lens of very specific categories, like the United Methodist, Global Methodist thing. Look, this thing started, whatever we call it, with a bunch of students, probably at least half of whom are neither Global Methodist or United Methodist, and wouldn't be able to tell you anything about that situation.
We have common antecedents, but they're not causally related.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
And then other people have tried to view it through the lens of, say, political categories, like American political categories. Well, isn't this just some kind of Christian nationalism?
Right.
And that's not the case. I think when you're dealing with a genuine manifestation of the presence and power of God, the real ones, right? They defy all categories, right? That's what makes them powerful, and it's what gives them their drawing power. Right. Holiness is almost by definition indescribable. Right,
and I agree with you that it's almost amusing, except for there's a sadness to it, that's the construct that gets used, that the imposition of the late modern political dichotomy, which is a peculiarly American understanding of politics, that somehow that's going to become the interpretive frame for this. And I look back at the first generation, not necessarily the second or third, but the first generation of Pentecostalism, extremely interracial. Go back to the Wesleyan revivals. Well, Wesley was asking for simultaneously abolition, earn, save so you can give, and personal purity. It just isn't, the framing is wrong. And if one tries to impose the framing upon the event, they're going to misinterpret the event.
Absolutely.
I agree with you. I don't think that this has anything to do with American politics, except the condition of American politics, like the condition of the old line Protestants, has an antecedent in cultural anomie, this sense of meaninglessness. In that sense, they're all related, but they're not causally related, and the framing doesn't work.
And my sense for these students who have been at the center of this from the beginning, and that's, I think we can't say that enough, that this is, this was something that happened among the students at Asbury University.
This is 18 to 24-year-olds, almost exclusively.
And so one of the things I saw happening a little bit early on was, again, these are friends of mine who wanted to view it through the category or the lens of something like, 1970s, Jerry Falwell, religious, right, moral majority conservatism. And it just, I could sort of see that in the way they were describing and talking about it, or their cautionary I'm like, I've been in the midst of these, frankly, these kids, these 18 to 22 years, young adults, they don't look or sound anything like that to me. This is a different generation, and we need to be careful. This is not so much a theological point, but we just need to be careful about, transferring our experiences, whatever they might be, or the things that maybe traumatized us at some point, onto them. We need to give them the space to speak and the time to speak for themselves. And I think if we listen, we'll discover that a lot of people are saying this is a revival for Generation Z or this generation. Well, let's give them a chance to tell us what it is they think and what they've experienced in this revival, and not just sort of foist upon them all these other categories from the past.
Yeah, and I admit anecdotes illustrate, they do not demonstrate. So I want to acknowledge that right away. But the students I've talked to from the university, and some of our students who are younger and are fully participating, they are concerned simultaneously with justice and with personal purity and with mutual accountability. It really does sound like a Wesleyan revival to me. That is a peculiarity of it. I don't know that it would have worked in another environment. It really sounds like a mid-18th century revival, in that they expect to be changed. They expect to start, if they were not Christians, they become a Christian, born again, because they're supposed to mature. Or if they already are Christians, they see this as a transition toward, well, you use the word, toward holiness. And I'm not trying to vest the word with magical power, but toward this idea of mature Christian living that will actually give a sense of meaning in an otherwise seemingly meaningless world. Can I ask one other question?
Well, let me say one thing back to that really quickly. You have your question in mind?
I got it. I won't lose it.
So I would say that my hope and prayer is, arguably your generation and my generation, right? Our generations, we have not held.
They're only a half generation apart.
They're only a half generation.
Let's not overstate this difference.
We'll call it our generation.
Okay.
Well, our generation arguably hasn't done a very good job of holding together, let's call it personal piety and the concern for justice, right? We've, if anything, allowed these things to become, enemies and sort of, we're polarized around them.
I mean, it goes back to the fundamentalist modernist controversy. Somehow it keeps rearing its head in American culture.
And my hope is maybe one of the things that could come out of this is that perhaps God is raising up a generation that will model for all of us that these things are not enemies, but in fact they actually depend upon one another in a very deep way.
It would be shocking to American culture, or at least to the dominant forces in the media, if a large segment of persons under 25 or under 30 started actually intelligently and coherently advocating for sexual purity, discipline with how they spend their money, and social justice for the poor, and racial concerns. And on our campus, this is obviously also a central issue, and what happens to people in the global South. Because that gets ignored in the United States too. You know, if they can raise that up coherently, God bless them. I mean, I think that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, when you work for social reform, when you feed the hungry, when you visit the sick, right? These sort of on the justice side, these things deepen piety.
Right.
And
very Wesleyan of you.
And piety motivates us to do these things.
Right.
Rightly understood, these things depend on each other, right? And they are fulfilled in one another.
Works of mercy and works of piety have to both be present in the means of grace.
Absolutely.
Well, here's my closing question, because it takes us all the way back to what we were talking about when the cameras started. You know, my current research interest is in pilgrimage, and I've walked a lot of the historic pilgrimages now. And God bless my sainted wife and my old prayer partner from earlier in ministry for having walked many of them with me. There is something that happens when one enters into sacred space, and it really is it's an aesthetic experience. It's also an ethical experience. It's even an epistemological experience in the sense of all the of the beauty and the goodness and the truth. There's a suspension of chronic time for kairos. Having said that all occurs, there is a push against that in Protestantism. How are you approaching this? Because Protestantism does want to say God is equally accessible anywhere, and I agree with that, but I also experience sacred space as sacred space. There is something different about being over there or being in the chapel here as opposed to wandering across the campuses. So,
I do think in much of Protestantism, and this is certainly a deep concern of mine, there is something like an antipathy to the idea of sacred space, of holy places, holy objects. I think in a lot of the Reformation, we wanted to set all those things aside. But the holy won't be set aside that easily. And what you notice, and I know you've done this personally, I've done it, whether you're just going on a pilgrimage yourself or you're leading one with a group of people. What we say and what we do in this case as Protestants turn out to be two different things. And it turns out that Protestants are just as likely as our Catholic brothers and sisters to go to the Holy Land, right? Or if you're Methodist, to go to all the Wesley sites in England.
Or Indian Springs.
Or Indian Springs. We go to places that we believe that the presence and power of God has been manifest in a special way in the past. In my view, the only question is that we have to ask ourselves, and I think this is what this current situation is really posing to us as a question. Are we going to be cessationists where the holy is concerned, where the manifestation of God's presence and power is concerned? So we can visit Mount Sinai, right? Because that's, on the right side of when that stopped happening. That's Old Testament. We can go to the holy places in Jerusalem, right? But that's where, that's still on the right side of when this stopped happening. Now then the question becomes, well, exactly when did it stop happening, right? When did the holy cease to be manifest? These kind of events, I think, make all of us take a long look in the mirror and ask that question.
I think that's a great observation. So let me try two things on you. So in our tradition, going to the Indian Springs campground or going to Hollow Rock campground almost has the same feel as going on pilgrimage. there is something about our tradition, maybe all Protestant traditions, that we take history up through the Acts of the Apostles, maybe into the Revelation, jump up, stop briefly at the Reformation, but really get all the way up to the Wesleyan Revival and start keeping track of time again. Part of that's going on, that we're disregarding the sacredness through all the kairotic time that occurs during chronic time. We're ignoring periods. The other thing I do wonder is, and you touched on it, is when Protestantism correctly rejected the constructs of the pre-Reformation Western Church. It had to occur. It really had hit a point of corruption. That being said, as so often happens with corrections, did they overcorrect? And you mentioned much earlier in our conversation sacramental language. Can we get to the idea of sacred space with the language of real presence without falling back into transubstantiation arguments, but also not saying, oh, it's just a symbol of what we all experience everywhere? Because it isn't just that. Something else, there is a real presence.
Yeah. This overcorrection, there's no question in my mind we overcorrected on all kinds of things.
Yeah.
It's understandable in hindsight, but when you set aside something like penance, for example, well, there are long-haul consequences in the area of pastoral care. How do you help people to work through the consequences of sin?
And the Wesleyans tried to grab that back.
Right. Yep. So we set aside a lot. We threw a lot of babies out with the bathwater, not thinking about what the consequences would be in the long haul. Now, I want to tie together this with your question about camp meetings, places like Indian Springs, and so one of the things that gets set aside, as you know, in the Reformation is the cult of the saints.
Right.
And as Protestants, that just kind of gives us the, we don't like that, right?
Yep.
Now I would actually argue that we've got saints, right? We don't want to call them that, but we absolutely have saints, right? Yeah.
But they haven't done supererogatory works. They've just done the regular works well. Okay, yeah.
So the cult of the saints, though, if you think about it, it's very local. It's very regional. And what any particular saint in a very specific place represents, embodies, is the presence and power of God manifest in this world, in their life. And the cult that develops around them, is a recognition of that, a desire to participate in that ourselves. Now, with the camp meetings, at a place like Indian Springs, which I've got personal experience with, I think it has.
You drink that sulfur water?
I have. I've smelled it too.
It's potent. It really is. Yeah.
So the thing about an Indian Springs is it's a very regional kind of thing, and it's a multi-generational kind of thing. That people that go there and that experience that place as holy ground, right? It's because of that their parents or grandparents, many generations, experienced the transforming power of God in that specific place, and you go back there hoping that the same will be true for you, right? And so I think in a way it's kind of similar to the very local, regional character of the cult of the saints. And what I tend to think is when you set something like that aside, it'll show up. It has a way of coming back, right? And the holy will only be pressed to the margins for so long.
It's like the resacralizing we were talking about earlier.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it shows up in forms of Protestantism in very strange ways, and in a different guise. It might be through practices like camp meeting and the sort of attachment of a sense of the holy with a particular campground. But I think this is all sort of the localizing of holiness and of the presence and power of God. And we go to these places just like people are coming here.
Right.
Because we want to participate in that ourselves.
I agree. And so here's my concluding comment about it, because I think, obviously we seem to be seeing this pretty similarly. This seems to me, again, trying to step back and not be normative, because I do value it. Normatively, I am happy with this. Joyful. But if I step back and try to look at it descriptively, what I see happening there, and this is very much in agreement with what you've just described or explained, it's similar to Neo-Pentecostalism. It's similar to the large numbers of our students, if you want to call them sort of expert Christians, who are moving into high Anglicanism, even Eastern Orthodoxy. They want resacralizing. Christianity is not going to be purely cognitive to them.
That's right.
It's going to be expressed in engaging the entire body. It's going to be expressed in justice. It's going to be expressed in personal purity. They're really looking for a holistic understanding, and I think that's what's transpiring over there.
I would agree. And I guess my last comment would be a personal testimony that you and I have sat here talking about this and thinking about it through various lenses. We've been talking about it theologically and sacramentally and other kinds of ways. You know, but when I went over for the first time last Friday, you know, the third day of the revival, you know, one of the things that happened is I sat there in the back of Hughes Auditorium. I said, you know, this is one of those times where a theologian needs to know when to stop talking.
Yeah. Amen.